Welcome back to Ends and Means. I'm really excited for today's conversation. It's with Nick Hadsell. We're going to be talking about whether academic philosophy journals should publish AI-generated papers, and also a bit at the end, we're going to talk about divine authority, so a topic in the philosophy of religion. Nick, could you introduce yourself, say a little bit about what you do and where people can find your stuff?
Yeah. I'm Nick. I'm a graduate student at Baylor University. I am currently dissertating broadly on parental rights in the Republican tradition. So if you want to see anything about that, you can go to my Phil People profile where I have some stuff up. I also have a Substack where I'm trying to write about some of that stuff as well. What else can I say? That's pretty much all that's I'm sure there's other interesting things about me, but for this, that's pretty much it.
You look like an interesting guy. Um,
Yeah.
um, but let's jump straight into the philosophy. So you have a paper which you're working on right now with some other people, or with at least one co-author, about how you think that philosophy journals should eventually, when the technology gets good enough, accept AI-generated philosophy papers. So my first question is, you mentioned that this paper was co-authored. Was it co-authored with GPT-5?
No, I haven't paid for that yet, but that's we were thinking about doing it. No, there it's co-authored with a couple of friends here at Baylor, Kyle Hewitt and Rich Eva, and we were thinking about doing something like that because one of the first philosophy journal papers published with ChatGPT, that on its own maybe could make waves, but I actually think we've been beaten. I think there actually are some papers, not in philosophy, but I think in like medicine or some other discipline where they either have ChatGPT listed as a co-author or GPT was heavily involved.
Mhm.
I'm not really yeah, I'm pretty sure there is one. So I think we might have been beaten to
Yeah,
the punch on that. But
I mean,
no
haven't there been
ChatGPT involved.
cases of yeah, go on.
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say, yeah, no official ChatGPT involvement in this one.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, haven't there been kind of unofficial, illegitimate uses of large language models in publishing journals before, even if the journals weren't accepting them? Like, I'm, I'm maybe 95% confident that one of my papers has been cited by um, an article generated, at least in part, by AI. So, like, it was supposed to be doing a survey of happiness research, um, and then it did a footnote because issues of free will became relevant. It wasn't even a philosophy paper, and so the footnote was just listing the three positions in the free will debate: determinism, libertarianism, and compatibilism. And for the libertarianism bit, it cited a paper that I'd written called "Libertarianism and Conjoined Twins." But the problem is that the libertarianism I was talking about was like the political libertarianism, and so it then like took a quote from that paper about conjoined twins and made some link to free will, but didn't make the link. And it really feels like an AI just like it was told to cite recent literature with libertarianism in the name, and it just took that and made some kind of a link. So I don't know. I think this stuff is already happening, but and obviously we don't want papers of that quality being published if that was indeed published by by an artificial intelligence. But the LLMs are progressing, right? And so eventually the quality of the philosophy might end up being pretty good.
Yeah, I mean first, just to your example, I don't know, humans are actually pretty good at writing bad philosophy. So you tell me that this is AI generated, and that's plausible. I also think we're also just not great at reading things. So I don't know. Maybe it is AI
Maybe.
generated. Maybe it's not. I don't know. I have heard stories too of people getting reviewer reports, and the reviewer will reject the paper, or it'll be like a revise and resubmit. And the reviewer will recommend articles to read that were hallucinated, like they don't exist. So there's already somewhat plausible evidence that even peer review right now is being automated in these ways. But yeah, you're right. It does seem like there's this possibility that AI is going to get a lot better at doing philosophy than it currently is. I mean, right now, if you use like a really early version of ChatGPT, it's not great. Like I've tried using it for my logic course. It will mess up modus ponens inferences. It will make very basic mistakes to where it would be a long shot to think that, you know, it could be able to generate like an 8,000 word paper that would actually move anything along in our discipline. But we're just trying to imagine, like, imagine it eventually does get to a situation where you just ask ChatGPT, look at my thumbs up, my ChatGPT to write some really interesting paper in political theory, maybe challenging some popular theory of political legitimacy or something like that. I don't think it's all that far fetched that maybe one day it could produce a paper that is like excellent enough to at least merit consideration and maybe a middling journal, maybe one day even a top journal. I don't know. But it seems to us that this is possible. And if that's the case, I mean, I think that this is something that the discipline of philosophy and other disciplines as well have to really come to terms with figuring out what would we do if AI ever got to this point. I mean, and this is a problem that a lot of other disciplines are having to deal with. AI is getting progressively more involved in law. It's getting more involved in medicine. It's getting more involved in finance. And I guess we just think that because intellectual labor it is hard to automate, like totally. I get that, but I think, we could start getting there soon. Um, so we got to think about exactly, I think, what to do in these cases. And it's not just to add a little bit more plausibility. Like, I don't know, there are some really good papers that get published, and a lot of them are really great. There's also some that do feel just like really robotic and formulaic. I mean, you take like a basic reply paper; those are good, they're helpful. But I mean, all they're really doing is here's an argument, I challenge this premise, and maybe here's a way for this argument to improve to succeed later. I mean, that's like a very formulaic, basic way of putting together a paper, and like that seems something that AI could potentially be capable of doing. So yeah, we just think that if AI can ever get to this point, I mean, I don't think we have great reasons to just prohibit them strictly because they're AI generated papers. That's basically the argument of the paper.
Yeah, I mean, an immediate worry that anyone who's watching this, who's a philosopher, will have is, what about the philosophers? So what about you? What about me in the future? Won't this just make the job of philosophers redundant?
Yeah, that's a great question. It depends. I mean, so I think that there are parts of being like an academic philosopher that we think, at least plausibly, might be immune to automation. So one, for example, might be teaching. I mean, we don't argue for this in the paper. We don't build a case, but we think it's pretty plausible that teaching is just this thing that is irreducibly a personal thing. It's not just the dissemination of information. It's one person, teaching a student, but also building a relationship with that student, meeting them, knowing them as a person. And if you think that that's true, which I think is plausible, then you might think that teaching is the sort of thing that's immune to automation. Now, there are people out there
Mhm.
who think that you actually can have personal relationships with AI or robots, and that's a whole thing. We're kind of just taking the intuitive folk, or I guess the folk intuition, that that's not really something you're able to do. Uh, but if you're asking, like, maybe in terms of like the publishing world, like,
Mhm.
what if AI gets so good that humans get crowded out of journals? Like, that's the worry you're raising. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, we think that that scenario there strikes us as at least not required on the proposal of letting AI into journals. So there are ways for editorial teams to mitigate these sorts of disaster scenarios. So we recommend something called like the sponsorship model, for example, where if you want to submit an AI generated paper to a journal, that's great. You just have to be the sponsor for it. Maybe you have to vouch for the quality of the paper, and you have to submit it yourself manually. That could prevent already really exhausted and bloated, submission pools for being even more bloated and and that matter. And you know, editors do have an interest in keeping philosophy to be the sort of thing that humans are involved in, and they're invested in keeping AI from crashing their journals. So we think that there are ways that editors can mitigate these things. They could, for example, require that these submissions are tagged as submitted by AI, or they're AI generated, and they can filter perhaps. And maybe one day they want to go for the human written papers. Maybe the next day they want to go for one that's AI generated. So there are ways to actually, I think, mitigate these sorts of disaster scenarios. So those are my first couple thoughts. I mean, there's other worries too about like whether or not AI can put us out of jobs as academic philosophers, if they ruin, job hiring heuristics. And I don't know if you want to get into all of that, but those are just my first two thoughts about that question.
Yeah, I do. I mean, since you mentioned it, let's talk about the job hiring stuff. So the main way in which hiring boards, I'm told, decide who to hire as a philosopher is how much they've published and in which journals. And so if anyone can just use ChatGPT to produce a journal, then it's going to seem like everyone is on a level footing in terms of the quality of the work that they can produce, and that will make it very hard for hiring boards to decide who the best professors are going to be.
Yeah. So I have a couple of thoughts about that one. The first one's a new one that we haven't put into this paper yet. It's going to be another round of revisions, but we think, or at least I think I'm trying to convince my co-authors of this, but this is at least my view. I think you can be better or worse at prompting ChatGPT to do something. I think that actually could be in itself a skill, and depending on the input that you feed into the system and your skill at doing it to get it to generate better or worse things, that could be different from person to person. So my friend, or one of my co-authors, told me that apparently there's like classes on how to prompt ChatGPT to do better or worse tasks for you and stuff like that. But the example I was thinking of is, DALL-E, the image generator associated with ChatGPT. I mean, I've seen people post like, here's my 5-year-old daughter generating something on DALL-E, and it's like this picture. It's not great looking. Okay, like I don't want to dunk on a 5-year-old's art, but it's just not great looking. But you can imagine someone who knows ChatGPT really well, is familiar with DALL-E, they could probably come in and do the exact same thing going on in that picture, but make it a lot better, make it a lot worse. I don't know, depending on their skill. So I mean, we think that it's, even if everyone has the same access to these large language models, there's still a separate question about how effective they're going to be at generating output from it. So that might be a distinct skill. So I don't want to say that just because everyone would have access to this technology, everyone could just start generating paper. I think that is not necessarily a given. But we could just bracket that for a second and just think for a moment, how would this just ruin job hiring heuristics? I don't think so. So there's a couple ways of making this point. One is that if we really do happen to come to a world where AI crowds us out of journals, AI is just taking this thing over, then if you're on a job hiring committee, you're probably aware of this, right? You're probably aware that no human's been able to publish in like any journal, or maybe like any like top 30 Brian Leiter list journal in like a couple of years, because all these robots are publishing in there. So it would be, if you're aware of that, which I think that would be newsworthy, at least to the sort of philosophers who are senior enough to be serving on hiring committees, you'd probably know that and maybe adjust the way that you evaluate a candidate. So maybe if humans are beginning to become more obsolete in terms of academic research output, then you might have to shift gears and say, okay, well, maybe a few years ago, this would indicate how good a candidate would be. Maybe a few years ago, if they didn't have publications, that would be a real serious strike against them. But now, everyone's in this ecosystem together. We're going to have to maybe put more weight on the way they teach. Maybe we're going to have to put more weight on the way they interview, and so on. So we think perhaps in the short term, that might be a problem. Like that might be an issue. Maybe it's going to take some time for that social or hiring norm to make its way into the institutions. But we think long term, like it doesn't seem like a serious thing to just shift gears and have a different sort of job hiring heuristic. So that, I think that's our first two responses. I'm trying to think. I don't think in the paper yet we really have any other things to say about the job hiring heuristics. Oh, the last one I did want to say too is research is important, and like that is an important way people evaluate the quality of the candidates. But I do want to say that like research jobs are not exactly the majority of philosophy positions. Like the majority of them are teaching heavy. They're at small liberal arts colleges, at least in the United States. I don't know about how things are where you are, but that's how it seems to me. And in those cases, yeah, they do. Hiring committees seem to want people to have good research, but I've seen a lot of cases where people who don't have any publications or have very few will get jobs because they really like the candidate as a person. They've seen things interpersonally with them that show they're going to be great colleagues and stuff like that. And so also this is not I think this is not as serious a problem in the majority of cases where people are getting positions. So even if those responses earlier don't work, it's not a huge problem in most cases.
Yeah, that seems basically right to me, right? So like the problem, if it is a problem, is fairly narrow. At the beginning, there'll be some kind of uneven distribution of ChatGPT talent. So I mean, Timothy Williamson is one of the best philosophers alive today. There's a Twitter account of him run by his wife where she regularly posts jokes about how Timothy Williamson can't open his phone, and so it would turn out that Timothy Williamson probably wouldn't be very good at operating ChatGPT, and so he'd be put at a disadvantage relative to some young, smart Alec who could work ChatGPT better and put in better prompts. But eventually it would probably even out, and there are also these other traits on which hiring boards can make their decision. That seems right to me, but there are some other kind of ethical or institutional worries about this proposal. So one is many people think that if you're publishing philosophy papers, you shouldn't publish the papers without believing what you're writing, right? So to use the technical term, you shouldn't bullshit. You shouldn't say things without regard to whether they're true or false. But ChatGPT is doing this because it doesn't have any intentions or any regard for truth or falsity. So, is there really an important norm against publishing bullshit that we need to preserve?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a vexed question because, well, let's take a step back, right? If this is true that we have this publishing norm against bullshitting, AI is notorious for hallucinating. I mean, we just discussed about like the reviewer, for example. It's designed in part to give the user a really good experience. So if you're like, hey, give me a few sites about this issue, and they're like, oh, I don't know what that issue is, so I'm just going to make up something that sounds really plausible. You might think that's a case of bullshitting and we should exclude AI because it's doing that all the time. You might also think, uh, you know, well, yeah, I'll stop there at that. So if that's a norm against AI, then our proposal, I think, is in really big trouble. Um, I mean, there's just a couple things. One, it seems like people are publishing for reasons, or people can publish for reasons of any sort, and they're not really relevant to the peer review process. I mean, it would be very, very strange to me if an editor in a peer review process gets a paper, they find it's really good, they find it's excellent, it's quality, and all those sorts of things, and they pass it all through, and then they figure out you don't really care that much about whether what you're saying here is true. You just, want to publish this to get more job security or advance in your careers. Like, it strikes me that editorial teams don't really inquire about these sorts of things. And I think it's more than just they have this expectation or assume you do. I think it's just beyond the purview of what academic publishing is supposed to be about. It's just about, is this good philosophy? Is this excellent? Is it going to move the conversation forward? And if so, great, we'll take it on. Now, if you're doing something that's maybe it counts as lying, or maybe what, sending this paper off into this journal and saying these things for you counts as vicious, those are separate issues that we should look at. And maybe it reflects badly on you as a person in some way. Maybe it says something about your character. But in terms of what is the business of academic publishing and editorial teams? No, we're not really in the business of of policing those sorts of concerns. It's just, is this a good paper? Great, then send it off. And that's part of the reason why we think this proposal just makes sense. Like, if the purpose of academic philosophy is disseminating excellent philosophy, and AI gets to a point where it can start producing excellent philosophy, like, it seems like we can just connect the dots and say, yeah, let's go ahead and let them in. Why not? So, I mean, we think that this norm against bullshitters, I think it reflects perhaps on someone's character, but it doesn't seem to be a reason to exclude someone from the peer review process. And if that's the
Yeah.
case, I don't think it spells trouble for our view.
And there are cases in which philosophers publish without believing the contents of what they publish all the time, when it doesn't even seem to reflect badly on their character. So one of my favorite philosophers who I've had on the channel before is Stephen Kirshner, and he publishes papers all the time, arguing that some actions are right and other actions are morally wrong. But if you drill into it, he's actually a moral anti-realist, so he doesn't believe any action is right or wrong. And so every time he makes these positive arguments, he is publishing without belief. But you can just take him to be arguing on behalf of someone who does hold on to a kind of moral realism, or think that, or who accepts the background normative framework that he's arguing from. And that doesn't seem to reflect badly on his character at all. And so, yeah, I'm pretty skeptical of this norm against publishing bullshit.
Yeah, I am too. And I mean, even Stephen's work, I mean, whether or not he believes it, it forces the rest of us philosophers to think really deeply about, questions of moral responsibility. Like, it's one of those
Mhm.
things where you're like, moral responsibility just doesn't exist. You have this intuitive explosion that surely not, but then you have to kind of go back to the board and say, why do I have this intuitive explosion? So, these are, it's still valuable work regardless of what his intentions are or are not. And
Mhm.
one more thing too, just to add like another reason to reject this argument. Bullshitting seems like the sort of thing you have to have intentions that are bad in some way. And I think it's a stretch to say that large language models can intend or have intentions to do things that are bad or worse. So bullshitting seems to be this thing where you're asserting something as true without a care about whether or not that thing is true or false. That seems to be like kind of the textbook case of bullshitting, or the definition. And it just might be a category error to say that large language models can bullshit. They're not the sort of things that can have intentions, because they're not persons, they're not rational creatures of any sort. They're just sort of, and this is reductive, but maybe sophisticated autocomplete. And so another reason too is just like, Stephen might have this intention to set out an argument. He's not really caring or not whether it's true or false. He just has these other reasons in mind for publishing, and maybe that's bullshitting. But ChatGPT is not the sort of thing that can intend things. So, in my view, I think it's just a category error to say that ChatGPT is bullshitting. When it hallucinates, I think it's just maybe a shorthand for, just coming up with an error, making it look plausible to someone. But I don't think it's lying in the same way that, or bullshitting in the same way that we are capable of doing that.
Yeah, I mean, so the critic would have to say something like, when a human publishes through a large language model, they're bullshitting by extension. So, like, ChatGPT is bullshitting by extension because of because of the intentions of the person who's operating it. So like, I think someone like Stephen Kirshner does care about the truth when he publishes articles, but there are other motivations for which people publish philosophy papers which seem totally morally fine, that don't have to do with truth. They have to do with fun or play, right? So there's a philosopher called Tyrone Goldschmidt who published a paper called "A Demonstration of the Causal Power of Absences," and the paper is blank. And so the joke is, everyone got really outraged, and they were like, "How could an academic journal publish a serious-looking paper entitled "A Demonstration of the Causal Power of Absences," but have no content?" But then, the point was proven, right? Because the absence of any content caused the negative reaction against the paper, proving the thesis it laid out in the title. And there are plenty of papers that people write for fun or just as jokes. And as long as as long as they're tracking the truth or attempting to track the truth, it doesn't seem to matter much what their motivation is, whether they're doing it for fun or whether they're doing it because they really care about the truth of the matter at the end.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
I
yeah.
just wanted to respond to the critics' objection you mentioned at the beginning there. Um, I do. So you were saying that maybe the AI is bullshitting sort of indirectly, uh, or I
Mhm.
guess the person who's sponsoring the submission is bullshitting indirectly through the AI.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, I mean, maybe that's a good objection. My first response is just maybe to say, well, the norm of assertion governing this person, submitting this paper to a journal, I don't know if it's saying I, the sponsor, am saying these things through AI. It might be more something like I, the sponsor, fed a prompt into AI, and this is what the AI generated. So if it were the first one where the submitter is, asserting something and maybe he's using the AI to, I don't know, piece together his assertion, that might be one thing. And that I think that objection is true. The other way I'm thinking of it is this more detached one where it's like, I've got this prompt. I wanted the AI to say something about this issue. Here's what it came up with. It's really good. You should publish it. That seems to me to really put the submitter at too far of a distance to say that they're bullshitting indirectly. But I could be wrong. I mean, that's a good objection. I'll have to think more about it. I haven't thought about it. And then yeah, I
Yeah, I
did.
mean, I'm inclined to think that the objection doesn't matter, right? Because it's just a semantic way of classifying what the ChatGPT is doing or what the author is doing. It's not a substantive objection. It's just a semantic question of whether the concept of bullshit maps on to what ChatGPT is doing. But that doesn't seem to get at the heart of what the objector is really saying, which is that they think there should be this norm of believing what you publish or publishing with belief behind it.
Okay, right. I'm tracking with you now.
Yeah. Another ethical objection you raise is the worry that if we open the floodgates and allowed AI generated papers to be submitted to philosophy journals, there would be almost no prevention of plagiarism, or no meaningful checks against it. Um, so, what do you make of that kind of objection? Is it true? Does it matter?
Yeah, so this is a real worry. I mean, it does motivate a lot of the writers right now in like Hollywood, for example, who I think are doing some lawsuits against AI from like taking their material and then repurposing it as their own. There's a real serious problem. Um, I think we're kind of doing the boring thing and just saying, let's try to bracket that. Let's assume in this kind of hypothetical world that AI is at a point where it could actually generate sufficiently original, excellent, non-plagiarized work. We don't know if that will ever happen. I mean, none of us are people who, specialize in AI development and stuff like that. We're just kind of taking it for granted that it's not going to be able to plagiarize. This is not going to be something that would actually happen. Um, so and we think that there are ways too. I mean, it doesn't seem too far fetched for us to think of a world where ChatGPT or AI is outputting material and they're just sort of constantly citing the sources that they're pulling from. I mean, we think that that's a pretty. I think maybe that's a difficult thing to do. That strikes me as not too difficult. I don't know. Maybe it's a sort of speculation, but it strikes us as not uh, too serious of a worry. And in the event that look, suppose this does happen, like suppose AI does end up plagiarizing and the editorial team has to do something about it. Um, okay, like this stuff unfortunately does happen, and that's why we have the peer review process to make sure that we catch instances of plagiarism. And in the event that there's a plagiarized piece, editorial teams can revoke the piece or issue an erratum correcting something and take responsibility for the case, and the person who sent the paper could also do the same thing. So we don't really think this is incredibly a unique problem, especially if we're imagining a world where large language models are able and capable of generating, original thought-provoking pieces. And, this is not to say that AI is going to be completely underivative. Like, I think philosophers are, I get told by people and, you read stuff online that, in a paper, you really want to say something new, original, stuff like that. And I just think that that's a really high bar to clear in most cases. Like most of the time, we're standing on the shoulders of giants in the history of philosophy and also our contemporaries who are thinking about the same issues. That's not to say we can't kind of put them together and say, Socrates said this, and I also think this follows from it. We can do that. But yeah, we're also, a lot of doing philosophy is doing it sort of collaboratively, and so I think that there's a sense in which, we're doing that when we do contemporary philosophy now. And I think large language models will probably do the same sort of thing in some respects. So, yeah, the idea that AI needs to be held to the standard where it's just saying its own completely original, never been said before ideas is just, I don't think that's a standard we even hold us human philosophers to. And I think it'd be really difficult to hold. I mean, imagine, a human philosopher saying something that's never been said for the first time in, you know, thousands of years. That might be evidence that you've said something wrong. Like that might be really strong evidence that you've said something wrong. So maybe it's not even a desirable standard anyway. Um, so yeah, I guess the first thing is we're sort of trying to head this off by assuming AI is not plagiarizing. We think that there are pretty clear ways that editorial teams can deal with the issue when plagiarism arises. And then, yeah, I think third, AI is probably going to be derivative in a lot of respects, but I think so are human philosophers, and that's okay. That's kind of the part of the collaborative effort of doing philosophy in a community of other philosophers.
Yeah, I mean, so in cases of plagiarism where the AI is just lifting a large unattributed portions of text from other authors, that's fairly easy to check because presumably plagiarism checking detecting software can sort that out. But so you might worry about the kind of plagiarism that you mentioned, where it's not lifting large unattributed portions of text. It's lifting specific ideas from specific authors, but then putting it in its own words, such that a plagiarism detecting software couldn't find where it originally came from. And then presumably the philosopher who's writing the prompts might not know where the idea came from, because it might be on some on a corner of the paper where it discusses something beyond his field of expertise. It sort of brings a different issue in that they're not specializing on. Um, and then, suppose they send that paper to the reviewers not knowing that a specific idea has been lifted by the AI, passed off as its own. Um, and the reviewer assigned is also an expert on the same field as the author, and so they don't recognize where the unattributed idea came from. Um, there's a sense of corporate responsibility in which the editorial board is technically responsible for any plagiarism that happened, but I think we all recognize that to a certain point, that kind of responsibility isn't real. It's just a legal fiction. They're not actually morally responsible. They couldn't reasonably have been expected to know literally every idea that's been published in all of philosophy. And so then an article gets published with an idea that was plagiarized. Now, you might think this isn't unique to AI. It could happen in the human case too, where a person comes up with a specific idea of their own accord, but doesn't know that some other philosopher 30 years ago came up with the exact same idea first and should be cited accordingly. But the difference is that in the case of the AI, there was a causal connection between the philosopher who wrote their idea 20 years ago and the idea getting put in the paper without attribution. Whereas in the case of the philosopher who independently comes up with the idea and doesn't attribute it because they don't know that the idea wasn't original, there's no causal connection between them and the author. And so you might think that there's a moral problem in the ChatGPT case, but not in the case of the human author. And then, to forestall an objection, you might think, well, how can there be a moral problem in the case of the ChatGPT author, because it didn't know that it was stealing from another human. It's not a moral agent. It doesn't have the relevant kinds of intentions. But to that, I'd say, well, the immorality is kicked back a step. It's in the hands of the author who prompted the AI to write a paper for him or her in the first place, because they risked this happening, and the risk was non-trivial. And so in that way, there might be a unique objection to AI-generated papers that doesn't apply to papers written by humans. What do you make of that?
Yeah, that's really good. So, I mean, the first thing I want to say is I'm glad you at least acknowledge that the moral problem can be kicked back from the LLM to, say, something like a sponsor. I think that that's something we do want to protect, and say that in cases where things go awry with large language models, in cases where they do plagiarize, which is not a possibility we're trying to foreclose or say won't happen, or say it won't be a new issue that we're really going to have to deal with. So we don't want to be that idealistic. I think that this is a plausible worry. Um, so yeah, we can kick the responsibility back to the sponsor, and so I'm glad we've at least kind of said there's at least some party that we can hold accountable for the errors of AI. The second thing I want to say is
Wait, can
well,
I just jump in on that point?
yeah, sure, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so the moral responsibility in question is just that they took the risk of sponsoring the AI to write an article, because they can't reasonably be held responsible for not knowing everything in philosophy.
Oh, okay.
But in that sense, they're morally blameworthy for taking the risk. If they're morally blameworthy for taking the risk in a case where it goes wrong, then everyone who ever sponsors an AI to write an article is going to be blameworthy for the same reason, even if plagiarism doesn't happen, right? At least if we think that moral luck isn't real, which it isn't. So
Fighting
so
words there.
this is a general moral objection against anyone trying to publish using a large language model.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
This is great. I wanted to ask or press a little bit more about the thing you were mentioning about there being a causal connection that makes the case of AI
Mhm.
plagiarism unique from human plagiarism. So,
No, so it's not plagiarism. It's just somebody who comes up with the same idea independently, but doesn't know that it should be attributed to a person who came up with it earlier. So
oh, but
like
I think that would
yeah, go on.
go. I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, so like I independently come up with Philip Pettit's theory of freedom, and I write it into a paper. I'm not morally responsible for that. But that's a case where like I just independently come up with it, and there's no causal connection between me and the original author. But I'm imagining a case where the AI sifts through all the papers in the world, takes the idea from a paper, repurposes it, and then puts it into the paper and doesn't cite the original author.
Okay, I think I'm following
Yeah,
now. And sorry for the. I wanted
yeah.
to jump in. So I mean, a couple things. One, on my understanding of plagiarism, which could be wrong, I think that case that you mentioned about accidentally duplicating Phil Pettit's theory of freedom would still count as plagiarism. It just would be inculpable. Like
Mhm.
if this was published in a journal, for example, and Phil Pettit is like, "Hey,
Yeah.
that's like word for word what I say in Just Freedom.
Mhm.
This is
Mhm.
plagiarism." He might be mad, and then you could say, "Well, this is totally accidental. I came to this on my own." He's like, "That's great, but this is plagiarism. Like, and I'm not
Mhm.
mad at you anymore. You're not morally responsible, but there's going to need to be some sort of citation here." So I think that there are cases where plagiarism is plagiarism, but the person's not, maybe not blameworthy or maybe not culpable or something like that. So I think that would still count as plagiarism and anyway, and then we're back to this worry about not really being a
Culpable
unique problem.
plagiarism.
The second thing I did want to say too is,
Yeah.
and again, this is kind of the cheap move. Maybe it is cheap, but we do make it in the paper. We're just saying,
Mhm.
well, just assume just assume that what you have before you is this amazing paper that is like guaranteed non-plagiarized. It's written in the most beautiful prose that you've ever seen, and it advances this new novel problem that moves the discussion forward. Should you let it in? And we say yeah. Yeah, those other plagiarism worries we do try to head off uh in this discussion. And I do think right there, I do think there's checks against it. I do think I'm still convinced that it's not a unique problem. Maybe the amount of cases might increase, but I think in terms of like qualitatively, what counts as plagiarism between these, a human and an AI, I think is functionally going to be the same thing.
Yeah. I mean, so your cheat move, that's completely kosher. That's fine. You can always do that. Um, but if we kind of focus on the practical worry, so I was wanting to argue that there is a unique worry about the AI, and so you made this distinction between culpable and inculpable plagiarism. And there's no moral problem with inculpable plagiarism precisely because it's inculpable. And so to argue that there's a moral problem with asking ChatGPT to write a paper for you and publishing it, um, I need to argue that the plagiarism in question would be culpable in that case. And so, like, the argument for why it would be culpable was that the author took a moral risk of the AI plagiarizing some other author, taking their idea and then not citing the author, and then they published it. And so they're not culpable in the sense that they should have known the idea in question, and should have known who wrote it, but they are culpable because they took the moral risk. And like, let's just suppose that there is a substantial moral risk, in fact, and that there will in fact be a substantial moral risk of this happening when people AI generate papers.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that's great. And maybe if AI is at this developmental stage, then maybe it would be impermissible for including them into journals because we've got these other worries about they're so unreliable in terms of generating plagiarism or not generating plagiarism that it's just too risky. I mean, another example I was thinking about as you were
Mm.
talking is, what if the plagiarism wasn't even in the issue? It would just like it would generate this really long paper that's really good, but like on the 17th page, it's like, by the way, here's how to build a bomb and gives like bomb instructions or it like by the way in like footnote 124 it's like this really libelous claim against some famous person. We could think of all these kinds of things where, yeah, maybe AI is so unreliable at a certain point that it would be morally irresponsible, even if it has this chance of giving us really great philosophy. Maybe it's just so dangerous, whether it's morally dangerous with plagiarism or something like that, or maybe just practically dangerous with like libel claims and bomb threats and stuff like that. We shouldn't mess with it. And I think our view can accommodate this. I guess we just kind of make the hypothetical we're dealing with maybe just more in the future. Like suppose a world where AI isn't that dangerous or isn't plagiarizing like this. It's just producing excellent philosophical papers just like us humans. What should we do? So I think these are great. I think these are great points. Um, and it maybe just shows that the world that we're envisioning is a lot more in fantasy world than we're making out to be, which is totally, hey, that's possible. But
Yeah.
I don't know. I think the prospects are a little bit better.
I mean, to make it even less fantasy world, it seems like you don't even need the optimistic assumption about how good AI will be in the future about not including bomb threats and libel. Presumably one of the institutional checks around AI generated papers is that the author and the peer reviewer should read the paper. And then if on page 17 they see that there's a bomb threat or instructions on how to build a bomb or libel against a celebrity, they'd see that and then they would remove it.
Yeah,
And so, yeah.
right. That's what we're trying to sort of argue is just look, we do have checks in place. I mean, we are worried about plagiarism. We are worried about these other things. And that's part of the reason we have peer review because yeah, there are these dangers with publishing that we need a community of people to safeguard. And some things will get through the cracks and people might be more culpable or less culpable depending on how reasonable we could expect them to pick up on those things. But yeah, we already have these checks in place. So all these costs and worries that we're associating with AI, we already do have an institutional mechanism in place to make those less worrisome. So, yeah.
Yeah. And so just I was convinced by this paper. I read it maybe an hour ago, and I was thoroughly convinced. But just for anyone in the audience who still has a gut level ick about this proposal, um, you gave a number of examples designed to show that a paper that was a human generated by accident or unconsciously or without foresight or knowledge, that was still an excellent piece of philosophy, should still be accepted by a journal. You gave a number of examples along these lines that didn't involve AI, where it seems intuitively obvious that if the paper produced at the end of the process was excellent, it should still be accepted by a journal, even if it was produced in some way accidentally. Could you give one of those examples just to pump people's intuitions in the right way?
Yeah, and I should have headed with this because now I'm appealing to intuitions that maybe could get people more on board, but that's fine.
Mhm.
Yeah, so the example that we start off with is this case of Bob the sleepwalker. So Bob has this weird habit of sleepwalking. Sometimes he wakes up in the middle of the night and he's cooking a dinner. Sometimes he's, mowing the lawn. But one night he wakes up in front of this like 9,000 word manuscript that is amazing. It's like the best piece of philosophy he's ever written. And he thinks it has really good chances to be submitted to a journal. So Bob goes and submits that paper to a journal. Think of your favorite journal, the most elite journal. It's that one. And all the reviewers say unconditionally accept. This is great. No revisions. It can't even be revised because it's that good. And the editors are all in agreement. And the team comes around and tells Bob they want to publish the paper. And he's like, great. Also, I did produce it in my sleep. Hope that's okay. Like I was not around when this was produced. This was entirely sleep written. What should happen? This is an intuition pump. There are people. One of our philosophers at Baylor, Alex Pruce, actually I think it gave reasons about appealing to lying or something like that to say actually they shouldn't publish this paper. But most people we've talked to, certainly when we talk to ourselves about this, we're like, yeah, they should totally still publish this paper. Like, no doubt it's weird. Bob has a very strange process for writing papers, but if it's a good paper that moves the conversation forward and is excellent, sufficiently excellent, just like all the other papers in the journal, then it shouldn't matter if Bob was sleepwalking. It shouldn't matter if he was in a drunken stupor and tossed his laptop down the stairs and it turned into a manuscript. If it's a good manuscript that is good philosophy, the journal should accept it. And that to us is really good evidence that when we look at journals and we ask, what's the purpose of a journal? It's to give us good, excellent philosophy. And these cases of Bob the sleepwalker, Bob the drunk guy throwing the laptop down the stairs, whatever the case is, I think is evidence that we don't really care how the paper is produced. We just want the paper. That's what journals are for. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so you didn't say what Pruce's objection from lying is. I would imagine it would be something like academic journal readers, all three of them, anticipate that authors wrote the articles themselves, and so if they're presented with a journal article that was written by somebody throwing their laptop down the stairs, but they aren't told that information, then it seems like they're being lied to by the journal or by the author or something. But it seems like that worry just can be easily circumvented in a practical way by if the journal has this view that Proust has about lying, they could just have in all caps on the top of the paper, this paper was written by Bob throwing his laptop down the stairs, and then the worry about lying is just circumvented, right? And then it could be published.
Yeah. That's basically our view is just we recognize that in standard cases, the implicit thing you're doing when you submit a paper to a journal is I wrote this paper in a conscious state. But even that's like, I think even a stretch. I mean, would it be, I wouldn't feel lied to if a paper that I've loved and cherished for many years was written by a guy who was basically like blackout drunk and just wrote this crazy paper totally out of his mind, has no idea what's going on in it at all. I wouldn't feel lied to if there wasn't this preface at the top like, oh, David Lewis wrote this after he, drank the whole cabinet or something like I just that wouldn't really occur to me. Now, I don't know if that's a bad thing about me or what, but I think this idea that there's this really strong norm of assertion that, sort of requires you to have been, fully there, fully conscious, fully, you know, fully praiseworthy for what you're saying. I think I think that's too strong. Um, yeah. So I think I'm representing Proust's objection right, and I think his response to that was just, well, I'm kind of confused now about like what journals are doing, right? Like it seems like they're publishing people who are saying things and they're kind of talking to one another, and that's kind of the 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 purpose of the academic publishing community. And I think that's fair, but our thoughts are these cases show that we all just kind of have this intuitive sense that all those other concerns about like our motivations, our ability to take responsibility for being consciously writing and stuff. I think those are all like super secondary and less important than the real main thing that we care about with journals is just want good philosophy. That's that's the game. And if that's true, then if we get AI who can do good philosophy, then let's let them in.
Yeah. I mean, so one more practical worry that people might have quickly is, well, ChatGPT writes things very fast. A philosopher who's using it could write a lot. And so if we open the floodgates to journals accepting philosophy papers written by AI tools, then journals would just be flooded with submissions. Reviewers would never get any sleep, and they'd probably just stop accepting papers that they were asked to to peer review. And yeah, journals would just be like deluged with lots of paper submissions, and then you'd need even more journals when maybe we probably want fewer journals. And so the whole system goes kaput because the system is just flooded with AI generated papers.
Yeah, that's an important concern. I came across it on actually one of Brian Kaplan's Substack posts where he was entertaining, what academics are going to do in a world where AI can just publish a 10,000 word paper that's beautiful about like, systemic injustice immediately and just and there's not like two LLMs, there's like infinitely many and they can all submit it. What would we do? And he was just like, well, philosophers better start learning how to be more charismatic people because that's basically the only thing we're going to have is being personable, and AI is going to take over and crowd us out. I think in response to that worry, which is real serious, we this is why we're really insistent on something like the sponsorship model,
Hmm.
where you do have a human sponsor associated with AI generated submissions. So that way, you got finitely amount of people, doing stuff in the submission pool. You have people who can kind of vouch for the quality, which may or may not help peer review. That's kind of a weak point, but it's really to control against this infinitely many uh, submissions in the pool. And B, we think it's also plausible that these submissions can again be tagged where you have one this is just a human generated paper, which I know there's already some vagueness issues there if people use ChatGPT as like an assistant or Grammarly, but we think that there's probably going to be a suitable category distinction between a human generated paper and an AI generated paper. And if you tag those and you got an editor who's interested in kind of making sure there's an equal distribution among the submissions that he considers, well, then you have, I think, a manageable way of sifting through these submissions, right? Some days you can pass on papers that were AI generated to reviewers. Another day you can consider human generated papers, and it's up to the discretion of the editorial team to figure out how they want to do that. So we do think the sponsorship model is a plausible way to control against this Brian Kaplan worry that it'll just explode everything. Um, yeah.
Yeah, that seems right to me, and it seems like probably the strongest practical guard that you mentioned in the paper draft that you sent me was the suggestion where the journal says, okay, no more than one AI submission every 2 years, and then people will be very hesitant to uh, submit their papers because even if the submission wasn't accepted, they couldn't submit another one in 2 years' time. Um, and maybe you think, oh, there are so many journals that wouldn't work. They could just submit it to a different journal. But maybe there could be some kind of institutional network that meant that different journals communicated and they knew which paper had gone where due to like an online database that contained all of the submissions. And so it seems like there are lots of practical guards against journals being deluged by AI generated papers. Yeah, so I kind of want to pivot now to talk about one of your other papers. It's on the philosophy of religion, which is completely different from what we've been talking about just now. But it's on a problem I've been interested in for a very long time, but haven't thought too hard about. It's the problem of divine authority. Could you say what the problem is?
Yeah, I mean, very concisely, it's the problem of how God has the ability to morally obligate us to do what he says. I mean, that maybe there are better, cleaner versions of the issue, but everyone kind of takes it that it comes with the territory that if God exists, then of course he is able to tell us what to do and we have moral obligations to do what he says. And that seems to be a really questionable assumption that maybe it's pious. Maybe it really does turn out to be the case that if God exists, then he has divine authority over us. But it's one that I think just has not really been explored well. So in the early 2000s, Mark Murphy wrote this really great book, which I'm glad you told me you've read before, or at least are familiar with what's going on there. It's called An Essay on Divine Authority. And yeah, there he just explores some possible explanations for why God, just by being God, has authority over us, and shows that a lot of them just don't really make a lot of sense. So um, one of the chapters, and it's also a paper and a journal, where he shows that authority just it doesn't flow from any of the perfections associated with God. It doesn't flow out from his being all powerful, because yeah, we don't think that just because someone's powerful means they have authority, unless you're like a Hobbesian of sort. We don't really think that might makes right. Just because God can punish you or do something to you doesn't mean that he has the right to tell you what to do, right? It doesn't follow from God's omniscience. Even really smart people, right? Maybe we have reason to do what they say because they know the reasons that are already out there because they're really smart, but they don't morally obligate us like a real authority does. And yeah, perfect goodness too, right? It would be really good for us to do what a perfectly good God tells us to do. Maybe we have all the reasons in the world to go ahead and do what that good God says. But that's different from a sort of authority claim. Like Mother Teresa, really good person, but nothing really about her goodness would establish her as a sort of authority over us who gives us moral obligations to do what she says just in virtue of her telling us what to do. And if these ideas are true, then it looks like we kind of have some work to do when we say, God, just by existing, has the authority to tell you what to do. And it's a problem that I think a lot of theists haven't paid enough attention to, but I think it's a problem that certainly a lot of non-theists are very aware of. I think this is something that is going on in like Eric Wielenberg's work in robust ethics implicitly. I think it's a worry that, Michael Huemer raised recently in that debate between William Lane Craig and Eric Wielenberg. He says something like, why think we should have to obey God just because he creates us? Like if you were created by a demon, like would that mean you would have to do what the demon says because he created you? Like surely not. And yeah, he stops and he's like, I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm not trying to be funny. This is actually just a real serious problem that we just assume is not a problem. So I've been troubled by this issue since I read Murphy's book a couple of years ago. And the paper is my attempt at trying to reignite the problem, like get it back on people's radars. And then like if I'm successful, give an answer to it. But if I just get the first task done, I'm happy enough with that.
Yeah, I think you're certainly right that this problem is being discussed more by atheists than by theists who really should be discussing it more. So like you mentioned Michael Huemer. Michael Huemer will, in a number of months, come on the channel to have a debate with Philip Goff about like, whether taxation is theft. But Philip Goff has been talking a lot about the problem of divine authority recently in his back and forth with Richard Swinburne. So yeah, it definitely has relevance to the problem of evil and just like a whole host of issues in theological ethics. So could you explain what the causal account of parenthood is, and then how you weaponize it to create an account of divine authority?
Yeah. So the causal account of parenthood in rough form just says that in virtue of being the morally relevant cause of some child's existence, you thereby get duties to, take care of the child, raise the child yourself, or see to it that someone else takes care of that child. It's kind of depends on which causal theorist you ask, how they fill in those details. But the important point is, in virtue of being the cause of this person's existence, whether by procreation, whether by in the natural procreation, whether by like artificial reproductive technology, however you put those things together, you're responsible for taking care of that child. So this is a pretty common principle. If it sounds weird, it's a pretty common principle in a lot of other cases, like in tort law. If you get into a car accident, if you cause the car accident, then you're morally responsible for taking care of your victim. If they have to go to the hospital or if their car's destroyed, the court will probably see to it that you pay what you're due. And the explanation of that is, right, you caused the situation. And it's sort of the same thing in procreation or bringing a child into the world. You're bringing a child into the world who's vulnerable, who's needy, has all these material needs, but also these relational needs, where they need to be, I think, raised in a something like a parent-child relationship, where you have a stable relationship of loving adults to raise the child. And there's really good empirical evidence that shows that children have these sorts of relational needs. Um, at least in a parent-child relationship, and maybe more controversially, with their particular procreator. But that's not something I try to arbitrate. I just say, if that's true, if the causal theory of parenthood is true, that in virtue of being the cause of someone's existence, you incur duties to take care of that child, then I think, kind of a fortiori, God is the most fundamental cause of our existence. Like there's no better explanation of how we are here on theism than the fact that God is responsible for bringing us into existence. And in terms of relational needs, like our final end, and again, here I'm sort of assuming some things about our natures, but at least in the Christian tradition, like one really important fact about human beings that our final end is union with God. Like we seem to have this deep need for a relationship with God that pretty much defines our existence. Like if that story is true, then our lives are unfulfilled, marked with a lot of suffering until we reach, final union with God and the eschaton. And so I think a fortiori, if God is the fundamental cause of our existence, if he is the one for whom we were made for, then he seems to incur, some sort of duty to enter a relationship with us as well. Um, that's kind of the gist of the argument. I think there's more ways to make plausible, for example, why is it that he has to, you know, enter a relationship with us, or, why doesn't he have duties to like stop all possible suffering that we could ever face? And I give arguments for that in the paper. But that's kind of the gist of how I argue that God has a duty to try and enter a union with us. Now, you might ask, okay, from there, how do you get authority? How does divine authority get generated? Well, the only way that God can make good on this duty that he has to us to seek union with us, is to make us into the kinds of beings that are fitting for a relationship with him. God is holy. He's completely other, and there are things about us that make us unholy. And I don't get into what that is, but it might be our sin. It might be the fact that we're finite, or some other story about why we are unholy. But regardless, we're not fitting participants currently as we are in our unholiness for a relationship with God. And so I think that the only way that God can make good on this duty is if he has the authority over us to sanctify us, to make us holy, which I think at least includes something like moral direction. I think it includes something like practical authority over us to tell us what to do so that we can become holy beings that are fitting for a relationship with him. And so from ought implies can reasoning, given that God has this duty to enter union with us and he needs practical authority over us to fulfill that duty, he therefore has that authority. Now I know that that's a controversial move in itself. I get it in part from Elizabeth Anscombe and her account of political authority, where she says the state has a duty to, I think, like, um, oh, sorry, actually, in her discussion of parenthood, parents have a duty to give children like a sufficiently good upbringing. They need practical authority over their children to tell them what to do and to exclude others from meddling. And so ought implies can reasoning means they have that authority. And I more or less just try to take that idea and apply it to the divine case. So that's basically the view. There's a lot of moves going on. It's more complicated than I would have liked it to be. So sorry that was that was a bit of a long summary, but that's basically the paper.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not convinced yet. I have some objections. So I became a theist not too long ago, and so I have my own account, which maybe we can talk about if we have time. But I have some worries about this account. I guess you could split them into two categories. One is objecting to the causal account of parenthood, and the other is objecting to the move to God, and then the move from God to the authority claim. I mean, so here's an objection to the causal account of parenthood, which maybe isn't very convincing, but it's kind of fun. It uses similar sort of what implies can reasoning. So um, here's a plausible sounding principle. I shouldn't do something that will cause me in the future to fail in my obligations. That seems true. And now consider the following action. There's a button before me, and if I press it, 1 trillion people with a sort of positive welfare level will be created. It seems like a good thing to do to press that button. But if I do press that button, I won't be able to love all of my children in the adequate way, right? I'll only be able to meet even a tiny fraction of the people I create. And so then it will turn out that by pressing the button, I do something that causes me in the future necessarily to fail in my obligations of love and care for these children. And so then you have an argument for saying that pressing the button is impermissible. But pressing the button seems more than permissible. It seems great. And it doesn't even seem like there'd be anything bad about it, like any bad that's being defeated by the good that's being generated by creating all of the happy people, at least to me. And so that seems to be an argument against the causal account of parenthood, given that the causal account of parenthood predicts that if I cause all of these people to exist, then I have an obligation to love and care and raise all of the people that I create.
Yeah, that's a really fun case. Okay, so my I think my responses would be twofold here. The first is I think basically on every account of the causal theory of parenthood that I've seen, they allow for duties to be overridable or prima facie. So the move I think would just be you've brought trillions of people into existence and you're just not going to be able to enter a parental relationship with them of the same kind that you would say if you just had like 1 to 3 children. So it's actually just not maybe it's just not possible for for you to be able to actually, carry out that parental duties with them. And then you might just say, okay, I mean, one, the goodness of the situation is just so great, maybe that just in terms of just consequentialist reasoning, you might think, okay, maybe I'm all things considered permitted to go ahead and bring this situation about. I don't know if that's plausible because I've this is my first time entertaining this case, but that's one. Another is just I mean, ought implies can reasoning would still work here. So in a case where, you have one child in virtue of causing that child who's existing now and is vulnerable in these ways, you can fulfill the duty to raise that child. In this case with the buttons, you just can't. Like that's just it's you can't enter a parental relationship and raise 5 trillion babies at the same time. It's already hard enough to do that with like 2, you know? So so you might just say just really stick to your Ott implies can guns and just say this is just a case where they're not able to do that. Um, but that it is
Yeah.
interesting. And but here's a way to press the problem. And I'm not going to resolve it here because I haven't thought about this myself. But there's a there's an interesting nearby worry among like antinatalists who will say, you know, a parent by bringing a child into existence incurs certain duties to the child. Maybe one of them is meeting an adequate level of material welfare. Like maybe a duty is, you know, you're supposed to put food on the table for your child. But maybe if you live in a part of the world where that's actually like far from guaranteed, like you're so deep in poverty that you have a hard time even providing for yourself, you know, what happens when you bring a child into existence in those conditions? And I think that's like a tough problem. But it's one where, you know, maybe there's some sort of issue that you have, or maybe there's something bad about your character, or maybe you violated some other moral principle out there in the ether, um, to where maybe you shouldn't have brought that child into existence. I don't know. I'm really still working that out for myself. I don't know what to say. But that problem, I think, could really infect a lot of what's going on in procreation, where children are brought into the world in circumstances where I think it's very clear to the procreator that those children are going to live very difficult lives. And I don't know what to make of those cases because, you know, procreating and having children, you know, it's one of the most important things that a lot of people do. People go through very, very great lengths to do so, especially in cases when they're not able to naturally conceive. So the idea or making any argument where you might like restrict someone's right to procreate or saying someone shouldn't have been procreated, those are waters I want to tread very, very, very lightly on. So I'm not really sure what to say about that case. So that was my first long response to that problem. The second one might just be, well, maybe that's a problem for human parents, but God is God. It doesn't seem like he suffers similar limitations in terms of carrying out his parental duties. He's got a lot of resources. Even 5 trillion people, I imagine God probably still has the resources to, you know, as long as they're on a planet with adequate material conditions and stuff like that, he could still give them morally authoritative commands aimed at their holiness and yada yada. So yeah, I guess just my second response is maybe that's an issue for human parents, but I think with God, you might have to tweak some things. Maybe there is a way to reignite that as an issue for God, but currently I think that that just wouldn't be an issue for him.
Yeah, I mean, so like it was just supposed to be an objection to the account itself. It seems like you could modify the account to accommodate the case, if you thought that the argument was troubling. So you know, you could just say, um, if you cause a person to exist and you can, at no cost to yourself, uh, look after the child, form a relationship with the child, love the child, blah blah blah, then you have a duty to do it. And so if you sort of like add the ability into the case, then then it seems fine. I mean, you know, like earlier in your response, you sort of made the point that well, the obligation is just impossible to fulfill, and so by what implies can reasoning, it's going to be permissible for you not to look after everyone. And I was so like just to be clear, the point of the objection wasn't that, you know, once you've created all of these people, it's going to be kind of impermissible for you not to look after everyone. The thought is like, from the standpoint of someone who's deciding whether or not to push the button, you have an obligation not to, because then you would engender in yourself impossible obligations. So it's like a case in which I make a promise to one person, to, you know, to phi, and then I have make a promise to somebody else not to phi, and at the same time and in the same place, and that's like an impossible set of obligations that I've engendered on myself. And so the argument isn't like once I've made that promise, then then it's like impermissible for me to follow it through on one of the promises. The argument is I shouldn't have made those promises in the first place.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I totally misunderstood that objection then. Yeah. Then I guess what I was saying when I was riffing toward the end there about antinatalist worries about
Yeah.
bringing a child into the world in circumstances where you can't meet their parental duties or meet the duties that would normally obtain upon creation, whether that is a permissible thing to do. Yeah, I
Yeah.
have not in terms of like the I mean, that's something I'm going to have to actually answer because one of the chapters in the dissertation I'm trying to say
Mhm.
that I think parents could claim a right against the state for some sort of material welfare to support the raising of families. And this is something that was pressed against me is, people in conditions, you could do the button with the 5 trillion people. You could just do other more realistic ones of people suffering in very harsh conditions in the world. Would it be permissible for them to procreate? Yeah, and I just it's not satisfactory. I just don't have an answer on that, and I am really I'm very nervous about getting to that part of the dissertation writing. I will say there's this great book by Rivka Weinberg that I'm trying to go through called "The Risk of a Lifetime,"
Yeah.
where she answers questions about this. Actually, the whole book I think is addressing the issues of um, the risks we take on when we procreate. So I'm trying to get through that. So that's part of the dissertation I haven't quite met yet.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fairly sympathetic to like very permissive views about when it's okay to procreate. So I bite the bullet in the non-identity problem. So I just accept that I accept that procreating and producing a child with any positive welfare level is totally fine. As far as like the state question, that's a separate question. So I hadn't thought about that. It's very interesting. Um, I have. I have a different objection to the causal account of parenthood, um, which it comes from David Boone in another context. So he makes a distinction between being responsible for an existing person becoming vulnerable and being responsible for a vulnerable person existing. And he says that you engender various duties for causing an existing person to become vulnerable, you don't engender any obligations or any strong obligations by causing a vulnerable person to exist. No, sorry, but by being responsible for a vulnerable person's existence. And so he says like, okay, in a case where you crash into someone and you give them a disability, then it seems like you have various duties to the existing person who you made to be vulnerable. That makes sense. But consider a case like this. Suppose you're working in a lab and your colleague um, picks up a test tube instead of a coffee cup and is about to drink it. And so and if they drink it, they'll die. And so you charge at them and you grab them by the hands and you say, no, don't do it. But you have certain chemicals on your gloves that will cause them to have an illness and will make them need a kidney transplant from you in a few months. And so in saving their life, you cause them to have a different vulnerability that they otherwise wouldn't have had. And so in that case, you're responsible um, for a vulnerable person existing. But you're not responsible. So you're responsible for a person with a vulnerability existing. In that case, it doesn't seem like you have strong obligations to support the person through their illness and to give them an organ transplant when they need it. And in the case of parenthood, that's a case in which the parents are responsible for vulnerable people existing, not a case in which they're responsible for causing existing people to become vulnerable. And
Mm.
so that there could be an asymmetry there. And if there is an asymmetry, then it seems like the causal account failed.
Yeah, that's fun. I think I briefly came across that section of Boonen's. Is it his book on abortion from like 2003?
Yeah, the big one, defensive. Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think I remember seeing that, and I wasn't able to give it my time of day. But I think just given what you said here. I mean, is that so? This would defeat the causal theory of parenthood because my understanding was even in the case that you just gave, there are still duties that are generated on the person who saved the person to maybe like be there for the transplant. Is that the way the case goes? It's just the duties
Well,
aren't very
so
strong.
yeah, I mean, Boonin is trying to argue that you have no obligation to give the person an organ transplant when you grab their hands and save their life, but unavoidably in the process gave them a disability. So that's the intuition he wants you to have, and maybe you just won't have that intuition. As far as like whether you have any obligations at all, it's not clear, right?
Mhm.
It's not clear that you have any particular obligations to them, um, any sort of obligations of partiality, as opposed to like general obligations to help people who are sick. Um, suppose you're not friends or family with this lab partner and you have no kind of like partiality based duties to them originally. I think Boonin wants to say you have no additional duties to this person in virtue of saving their life, but unavoidably in the process giving them a disability that makes them vulnerable.
Okay, yeah, that's a case I just need to go find and read. I don't.
Yeah, yeah,
That sounds
okay.
imminently relevant for what I'm trying to say here. But I don't have.
Great.
I don't have a great response to say to it. My initial thought is here's how I'm kind of thinking about things, at least in like the divine case. God,
Hmm.
I don't certainly did not have to create us. I think his creating us was an act of grace,
Hmm.
and and I think God before he creates us knows through and through our natures. He knows that we're going to have material needs and that we also have this deep need that characterizes our existence through union with him. So God knows all these things about us, and he foreknows this, and he knows the environment he's about to put us into. And my thought is that if God graciously and freely chooses to bring us into the world uh, with those various needs, and if he chose to just put us out there into the world and let those needs go unfulfilled and let our lives kind of be characterized in very deep physical and spiritual suffering forever and ever, and it never gets redeemed. There's something about that that seems at least some sort of violation of a duty that I think the causal theory uh can explain. I mean, it would be kind of akin to like my way of thinking about this is it would be akin to God bringing us into bringing fish into existence, but in an environment where there's no water and there always will never be water. It's like bringing humans into an environment where, there's no oxygen. Um, like I don't want to. I like. I want to be careful and with ascriptions of like cruelty, but like these cases kind of seem pretty cruel to me. It seems like a way in which a causal, loving, good parent should not act. And I think if the cases where God creates us with this very deep need for union with him that could characterize our lives in very deep suffering if it just we never have an opportunity to have that fulfilled, like that seems like a really really troubling case for me. um the Boonin case, though, I'm not going to pretend I gave a response to that. I'm not even sure how the distinction Boonin's making there would map onto that case.
Yeah, yeah.
But that's just kind of how I'm seeing things. And in the case of divine creation. So I just need to go look at that passage. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how it maps on either. In the context of the book, he wasn't arguing, I think, for a causal account of parental obligation, or if he was arguing for it in an indirect way in a specific context. Um, but yeah, so let's maybe jump onto the kind of divine authority bit. So you mentioned that it would seem cruel if God created us with a need for fulfillment in Him, but then just didn't make it possible for us to fulfill that need that we have. Um, and so, one worry I have about this part of the account is that it's at least plausible that our need for God is a contingent fact about our identity and not an essential fact about our identity. Um, So God presumably could have created us with a deep need for anything. So like maybe we could be satisfied at our greatest when we like magnetize two paper clips and watch them dance around each other. And like he could have created us so that we were satisfied by just about anything. That wouldn't involve him needing to have divine authority over us for him to allow us to like get close to him and fulfill that need. But if that's true, then it seems like we don't have a solution to the problem, because then God could have just created us with one of these other needs and not specifically a need for him, and then he there wouldn't be a need for this kind of divine authority over us.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm taking on board a fact about our natures. I'm just assuming it from the outset that basically the Christian tradition, which
Mm-hmm.
as I've read things, overwhelmingly says that our end is union with God, and that's just a part of our essential part of our natures. I'm taking that on. Now, it could be the case. I think you're right. It could be the case that this is only a contingent fact about ourselves. It could be the case that there are other people in the tradition that deny this. So I actually, Bruce is coming up again. This is an objection he raised to me when I presented this paper. Is some people think, I don't know who he cited, that this need for union with God is something that is super added to us, that God gives us as a matter of grace. But in terms of what is our essential nature, that's not necessarily something that we have. So you'd have this weird part of my view where you could potentially have part of the population where God might have authority over them, because that need kind of gets the argument going, and then another part of the population that
Yeah.
doesn't. And I just was like, well, I'm assuming this thing. That's a fun, I wasn't able to really say much more about it. And he there's an example I think he gave of, suppose, like in Harry Potter, right? Like you can give someone like the love potion and they become like obsessed with you. Um, they have this now, they all of a sudden have this like deep need for like union with you, and you gave them, the potion. Would you have now like a duty to like, you know, be their boyfriend or marry them or something like that? Like this could get into some very strange territory, if this
Mm-hmm.
is not a essential part of our nature. So I'm definitely taking that on board. I'm pretty confident. In the paper, I footnoted a few places where you can go to see if, verify in our tradition, uh, if this is actually a plausible commitment. I think it is. But yeah, if it's contingent, then the argument either doesn't work at all, or it only works for those who eventually get that desire, and that could be weird in itself. So yeah, I'm just assuming we do have that, but that's a weird
Yeah.
possibility.
Yeah, no, if it's in the tradition, that's a fair assumption. I mean, I'd probably have metaphysical views that would make it not the case that union with God or a desire for it is an essential part of our nature, because like I just think we're souls, but I don't believe in any intrinsic teleology. So I don't think that it needs to be an intrinsic fact about these souls that they're directed towards anything. But yeah. So if you have that assumption, then I think you're fine. Uh, Proust's suggestion is interesting, where you could have like part of the population under divine authority and part of the population not, is very interesting. It gets you the same result as Mark Murphy's account of divine authority, just by a different avenue. Because like he thinks that only Christians who have voluntarily submitted to God's will are under his authority, and other people who haven't voluntarily submitted to his will, none of them are under his authority. And since like the people who have been super added with grace are presumably like coextensive with the settled Christians, if we're Christians and we believe in the Christian God, then you just get functionally the same result, but by a completely different avenue. So that's a cool result. Yeah, so one more objection I had to do with that move at the end. God has this duty to allow us to fulfill our deepest need, which is union with himself. But what implies can, and so that must mean it is permissible for him to do this, given that God can only do that which is permissible. So I think that does follow. If you accept ought implies can, you accept that God can't do the impermissible, and you accept that God has a duty to bring us in union with himself. But I'm wondering why a critic of your view who has accepted what you've said up to this point couldn't just say that God's obligation is a kind of conditional one. So they can say God would have the obligation to bring everyone to himself if it were permissible to do so, or God does have the obligation when it's permissible to do so, when it's permissible to fulfill it. And so, like, as far as what you've argued, I think you could like go for either interpretation of God's duty. It could be a conditional duty, as far as you've shown, or it could be just like an unconditional duty where God ought to bring everyone into a closer relationship with himself. But if we sort of go down the route where it's a conditional duty, God has the obligation to bring everyone into union with himself if it's permissible to do so, then you don't get the result that it is permissible for God to do it, because then it could just turn out that it's impermissible for independent reasons for God to put everyone under his authority. And so it would be great if God could permissibly bring everyone into union with himself, but it turns out he can't for moral reasons.
Interesting. Okay, so I was trying to get clear. What is you were saying? The duty is conditional on it being permissible for him to do so. I was trying to figure out what's
Yeah.
the permissibility attaching to, like what sort of thing. What do you mean by that?
Oh, I mean, so like, I guess it attaches to standing. So people have authority or fail to have authority in virtue of their standing.
Mhm.
And like you're trying to give an explanation for God's standing in this account for like why he
Yeah.
has authority over people. But I'm thinking like, okay, so you think it's going to be essential to God bringing everyone to himself, that he has this kind of authority. Um, but if there are independent moral reasons, meaning that God doesn't have this authority, um, then it will turn out that we should only interpret the duty conditionally. So if it were permissible, then God would have the obligation. But since he can't discharge the obligation because he doesn't have the requisite standing, um, then then God doesn't have the obligation.
Okay.
And
Tell
so
me tell me if
yeah,
this. Oh, I'm
go on.
sorry.
No, no,
Um,
yeah, I didn't have anything more to say.
okay. I wonder if the objection you brought up earlier about the button that brings about 5 trillion people into existence might be
Hmm.
relevant here.
Okay.
So maybe I wasn't as non-committal as I thought I was. Like maybe my thought is that God just wouldn't bring about the existence of persons that he couldn't fulfill his duties to. So that maybe there
Hmm.
are worlds like that exist. God wouldn't realize that because maybe some fact about um, I mean, one of the reasons that I think that the causal theory is true, that creators are required to take care of their children in certain ways, is that um, children have this really deep value that makes certain ways of treating them, respectful or disrespectful. And so worlds in which, God creates people, but for some reason he can't relate to them, maybe those are worlds God just can't create because to do so is just really disrespectful to the value of the children that he creates. And so God would only create those worlds where the material conditions or whatever needs to hold so that he has the space to be able to pursue union with his children. Because failing
Yeah.
to do so and creating worlds where all of them exist, unfulfilled existences, or even a lot of them, or most of them. I haven't thought too much about this scenario, but worlds like these are just not fitting ways to treat people with the value that we do. Um,
Hmm.
so maybe I wasn't as non-committal as I thought I was about the button thing. Maybe
Yeah.
maybe actually God just wouldn't bring these worlds into existence where he can't fulfill these duties. I'm not. I
Right.
think
Yeah.
that's a
So
response
yeah.
to your
Go on.
objection. I don't.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I think it is a response. So tell me if this is the move you're making. We're confident that antecedently that God has created the world, that there is some account of divine authority, and that the parental obligations account, your account, is the only good candidate. Um, and then we derive from that that like if it were impermissible for God to create to yeah, if God couldn't fulfill the relevant obligations, then he wouldn't create the world, but he has created the world. And so we have empirical disconfirmation of the principle, that of like the conditional version of the principle. um is, is that the move?
Yeah, that sounds right to me. I mean, one thing I'm having, maybe I just have like a
Yeah.
lack of imagination, but I have a hard time
Mhm.
seeing that there is a world where God couldn't actually fulfill these causal duties that he has to his children. Um, like I think God's again like quite sovereign. You know, he has the resources to do a lot of things with respect to a lot of
Yeah.
people. And I know like you might think, well, the duty is to have union with his children, and if you
Mhm.
take free will quite seriously, like there's going to be cases where it's impossible for God to have union with
Yeah.
his children who perpetually reject him. And I think my account is actually compatible with that. It's just going to be a really
Mhm.
unfortunate case where God did all he could to give them an opportunity for union with his children, but it's sort of like a prodigal son case without the happy ending. Like the child runs off and never returns, and God is sort of I think in the position of always yearning and always trying to reach out for them, always open for their return. But yeah, maybe there are just cases where people refuse that offer. And all I'm
Mhm.
kind of after is God at least needs to be the good sort of parent, the good sort of loving parent that he is, and always give an opportunity for people to have union with him. That's not a guarantee they'll take it. And yeah, there are going to be many worlds. Maybe our world is like this, where people refuse that possibility. So I mean, one thing I kind of wish maybe I was more clear about is I don't think my view is necessarily like a universalist one, um, where everyone in fact will enjoy
Yeah.
union with God. Um, it's one thing if I could revise this more substantially, I think I would have made more clear. But it is obviously compatible with, if you think universalism is true. Yeah, which is
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's the thought.
Mm. I mean, so I wasn't thinking that the thing that would restrict God's ability to bring everyone to Himself would be like the material conditions that are under His control. I was thinking more that if we think that divine authority is required by God to bring everyone, or like give everyone the opportunity to come into union with Him, um, there could be an essentially moral reason why he can't have this divine authority, namely that he just doesn't have the requisite standing. Um, and so the objection I guess I was pushing is that all your argument has shown, it seems to me, is that if God, uh, if God had the requisite authority, then he would have the obligation to use it and bring everyone to himself. Um, but we'd still need an additional argument for why he has the authority in question, um, besides the one that you've given. So I guess the objection I'm pushing is that you just actually haven't explained why God has authority.
Yeah, okay, I'm getting it now. Sorry, I missed the objection again. Yeah, so is the idea like, okay, so maybe you've shown that ought implies can means
Mhm.
that God does have authority, but the explanation for why he has it, that's a different sort of story.
Oh no, so I was thinking that you haven't even shown, so like ought implies can be true,
Uh-huh.
and if it is the case that God ought to use his authority to bring everyone to himself, then he can and should, then he can do it, right? But
Mhm.
I'm thinking like you'd need to have already shown that God has the requisite authority. So it's so like the conditional is like
Okay.
if God has authority, um, then like he should bring everyone into union with the authority. But like
Okay.
you need an argument that he has the authority.
Okay. So let me try this again. I think because maybe this is a response I gave earlier, and I don't know
Mhm.
if it worked. Maybe it wasn't
Yeah.
satisfying, but could there just be a principle where I just say, okay, well, there's some fact about like divine goodness or something that would prohibit God
Mhm.
from realizing a world where he doesn't have authority and thereby couldn't fulfill duties to us. Like would that satisfy, or would that at least be a response here? Or sorry, I might be really missing and I apologize. I'm trying
No,
to
I mean, so
answer.
like I think it is a Morian response if you're already committed to the view that God has authority and the parental view is like the only good candidate.
Okay.
So like the fact that God has created the world means that the parental account must be true because it's the only account that's anywhere near a good account, and we have great reason to think that God has authority and created the world.
Right.
But if somebody didn't have those priors, I guess I'm thinking that that kind of argument doesn't work. Um, I've maybe slightly lost myself, but like the thought was kind of like, okay, all of these arguments have shown um, that if God can bring everyone to Himself, where like a condition on Him being able to do that is that He has authority, then he should use it. Um,
Mhm.
but you haven't shown that God has the authority.
Okay.
So like you haven't shown that He actually can. I think.
Yeah. Sorry, sorry I made you lose yourself a little bit there. I was
That was
struggling to
me.
get this objection.
Yeah.
Maybe I just need to think more about this and we could talk about it offline. I don't want
Yeah.
to like,
Mhm.
mislead
Good idea.
everyone into oblivion. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about it that I haven't already said, which I
Mhm.
think is just evidence that I'm probably just not quite following. Um, maybe I could figure out like,
I think
what
I'm
you
not
know.
following myself either. So
No. When you try to re-explain an
okay.
objection multiple times to someone who's not getting it, like it makes sense if things trip up. So no, that's on me. But maybe
Yeah.
we could talk about it more offline.
I'll try and figure out the objection later. We'll talk about it offline. This seems like a great time to end things. Nick, is there anything you'd like to say in closing? It's been great having you on.
No, yeah, this is really fun. Yeah, thanks. I hope I made somewhat of a convincing case, at least for AI, and that the problem of divine
Mhm.
authority is still very serious. Um, Substack is awesome. I really enjoy your Substack and Matthew's Substack. I think more philosophers should get on there. It's a great
Would
platform.
you just say the name of your Substack one more time so people know where to find you? I'll put it in the
It's
description too.
it's actually just my name. It's just Nick Hadsell.
Okay.
I had a brand for it earlier, but it was cheesy and I did away with it. I didn't like it. So it's just my name right now. That's where I'm
Mhm.
that's where I'm stacking at.
Well, great. It was lovely having you on. This has been Ends and Means. Thank you for watching.